So how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for doing this.
My pleasure. Looks like it's been a great news-making weekend.
It actually has. It's funny what happens when you actually ask presidential candidates about themselves as opposed to just asking about other presidential candidates. They might make some new news. I want to talk to you about the news out there because your background in the military, being in the Senate, I have brought this up with the presidential candidates, but now having a senator who actually probably knows a little bit of perspective beyond them, we have this weird situation shaping up in West Africa where we've developed a lot of resources for our military and been building relationships with those nations to combat Islamic radicalism. And suddenly we're seeing multiple coups and destabilization of those countries. Is it too much to say there might be some organized effort to start destabilizing these countries, or is it just a pattern that's happening there?
I'd say it's something that is unfortunately not uncommon in that part of the world. When you think about it from America's perspective, though, I think the main question we should be asking is not who is ruling this or that country or how they came to power. It's whether they're pro-American or anti-American. And that's something that our Democratic friends don't often do. What we want to do is maintain ties with every government around the world that is supportive of America and our interests and will act to further those interests when we need them to. Look, if we lived in a perfect world, all of our allies could be democratic countries that share our cultural and religious and historical and linguistic backgrounds. That's why countries like Israel and Great Britain are our best allies. Or even if you look at the summit just yesterday with Japan and South Korea, even if they don't share that cultural and religious and linguistic historical background, they still share our democratic system of government. If we lived in a perfect world, those could be our allies and partners. But unfortunately, we don't live in a perfect world. We live in our world, the real world, a fallen world, and we have to take our partners and allies as we find them. And that's why when I look at foreign governments, I ask first and foremost, are they pro-American or are they anti-American? And the reality of the matter is, too, is if they are pro-American, they are much more likely to be a more moderate and modernizing kind of place as well. I mean, what are the worst regimes in the world? China, North Korea, Syria, Cuba, Iran, Russia, governments that have all chosen specifically to be hostile to the United States. Just the very choice of deciding to work with the United States, even if you don't share our political system, even if you don't share our cultural and social sensibilities, you still, by making that fundamental choice, are putting yourself on a path to becoming more democratic, more capitalistic, and more respective of individual rights. So that's kind of how I think about these things.
Okay, you and I share a very similar thought pattern on this, which leads me to Saudi Arabia, which I understand the outrage over the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. I understand Saudi abuses. I grew up in the Middle East. But also, it seems like this administration has driven Saudi Arabia into China and Russia's camp more and more, when they used to be a great partner of ours in the Middle East, not just for oil production, but also for security in that part of the world. It seems like we've dropped the ball in the Middle East.
Very much so. No, Saudi Arabia has been a vital partner of ours for 80 years. And again, the very fact that the current king's father, the Crown Prince's grandfather, made the choice in the 1940s to side with America as opposed to siding with the Soviet Union, has moved Saudi Arabia over the decades in our direction. I was just there 4 or 5 months ago, and it's changed radically from when I was last there 8 years previously. You had young men and young women mixing in public. Women are driving, women are working. Young people are expected to get out of their house and get a job and to become productive members of their society. They're trying to diversify their economy so it doesn't just depend on oil commodities. That's very different from what it was 8 years ago, much less 80 years ago. I would broaden the look a little bit beyond Saudi Arabia, though, to the whole Middle East and take it back to the Obama era. Barack Obama made Middle Eastern politics kind of a facsimile of American politics. He grafted our politics onto Middle Eastern politics during his time in office by trying to create a new rapprochement with Iran. Again, one of the worst regimes in the world that went far beyond just the nuclear deal. The nuclear deal was just one aspect of that, trying to elevate Iran and therefore trying to weaken and undermine its traditional adversaries, Israel, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and some of the other Gulf states. And if you were opposed to that effort, Here, you're called a Republican. But if you're opposed to it in the Middle East, you are viewed as having a red jersey on. And that's why Barack Obama and his understudy, Joe Biden, have been so hard over the last decade on Israel, on Saudi Arabia, on the United Arab Emirates. And if those countries and their leaders are wearing red jerseys in the eyes of the Democratic Party, well, who's wearing the blue jerseys? The blue jersey is on Iran and all of Iran's proxies and allies, like militias in Iraq and Syria, or Hamas and Hezbollah and so forth, which I think is a very dangerous way to view the Middle East. And it's one reason why we've had to send aircraft and ships back into the Middle East now, while we're apparently going to put troops and Marines onto civilian shipping vessels because Iran is threatening them so much in the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. And as you say, the end result of all this is not that we've elevated Iran or somehow moderated the Ayatollahs there, it's that we've driven some of these countries closer to China. Because if you sit in Riyadh or Abu Dhabi or even Jerusalem, you have certain security needs based on the world you live in. And if Joe Biden won't invite you to the White House or he won't shake your hand, that doesn't mean those security needs go away. It means you have to look somewhere else to fulfill them. And China is the next best place for them to look if the United States and our partners in Europe are going to turn their back on our friends in the Middle East.
Moving closer to home, you've been one of the vocal members of the Senate on the Republican side about the need to support Ukraine. And it has continually made sense to me that a Russian threat against NATO and the United States that we can diminish makes sense for the United States. Yet on our side of the aisle, there does seem to be this louder isolationist movement that it's not reflected in political polling. You certainly see it reflected online of loud voices thinking that somehow we either should be on Russia's side or we should stay out of it, that it's not in our interest. And yet it seems to me it makes perfect sense for us to try to help the Ukrainians wind down the Russian military in some way.
Yeah, I like you, Eric, and I suspect a lot in the audience, support Ukraine, but I don't support Joe Biden's Ukraine policy. It was Joe Biden's timidity and weakness and concessions to Vladimir Putin in 2021 that tempted Putin to think that he could go for the jugular in Ukraine and succeed. And not just the calamity in Afghanistan 2 years ago this week, but also the one-sided concessions that he granted to Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin has wanted to reassemble the greater Russian Empire ever since he took office. He's invaded Ukraine once before. I note, and I sometimes note to my Democratic friends in the Senate, to their dismay, that Vladimir Putin only seems to invade Ukraine when a Democrat is president, not when Republicans are president. And that's because he was scared of America again whenever Donald Trump was president. But Joe Biden tempted Putin to invade Ukraine. And then he's prolonged the war. I share what some of the critics of our support for Ukraine say, is that the war's already gone on for 18 months. We've had hundreds of thousands of casualties. I regret that as well. I wish it had never happened, or I wish it had concluded much earlier. I wish Joe Biden, rather than continuing to say we're going to support Ukraine for as long as it takes, would say we're going to help Ukraine win as fast as they can. And we could have done that if Joe Biden hadn't pussyfooted around for 18 months and denied this weapon system, but let them have that one. But then given them this one, but then denied them the other one. And it's in a consistent pattern, is that he's racked by unwarranted anxiety about what's happening in Ukraine, which, for the record, it is much less confrontational or provocative than anything America and Russia did to each other in the Cold War in places like Korea and Vietnam and Afghanistan. And that has had the effect of prolonging the war, and now in this most recent campaign, making it harder for Ukraine to regain the territory they might have never lost by giving them months, giving Russia months to dig in and fortify their positions and lay out minefields and other obstacles. And still they don't have the armor or the aircraft or the long-range missiles they need to help overcome those fortifications. Wouldn't it have been much better if we'd just given them all that a year ago, before those minefields were laid, before those trenches were dug in, before those fighting positions were built, so they could take back their own territory? That's my position, is that from the very beginning, I've supported Ukraine, but Joe Biden has been wrong on Ukraine on almost every turn.
A lot of people in the crowd have been concerned about military readiness in the country generally, in particular when it comes to China. Several of the presidential candidates have mentioned the audacity of the Biden administration to be as public as they are, that we can't make ammunition and weapon systems fast enough. Do the Democrats even understand the core function of what our military serves these days?
Well, I think the Democrats view the military as just another government agency, oftentimes as a kitty to rob to pay for their domestic priorities. And that's true going back decades. Even so-called strong or hawkish Cold War Democrats like Harry Truman and John F. Kennedy grossly underfunded the military, to say nothing of Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and Joe Biden. And oftentimes they view it as kind of a playground for their social engineering, as opposed to what it is, which is the most fundamental institution of our government, what keeps us free and preserves our way of life. It's not the highest function of our government. That's to preserve justice and help create prosperity so our families can thrive, but it's the most fundamental. It's the most fundamental. It's the thing that has to come first before anything else. And the Democrats just don't see it in that regard. You know, Ronald Reagan, in the middle of his fights with the House Democrats in the early 1980s, explained that the defense budget is just different from any other kind of government agency. You know, with the defense budget, you have to take stock of what your threats are, and your enemy gets a vote in those threats. And then you have to allocate the money necessary to counteract those threats and, if necessary, to defeat them. And that's how you get to the number that you spend on your military. Your strategy has to drive your budget. Your budget can't drive your strategy. And everything else government does, it has to be the budget and what you can afford driving what you end up doing. But you know, the military is not our road systems, not our park systems. As important as those are to us, it's the most fundamental thing that our government does. It's kind of like law enforcement at the local and state level. Of all the other blessings of liberty, you cannot have them if you don't have safe streets and law and order at the local level. Same way it is in a dangerous world. You can't have all those blessings of liberty if you're not secure at home.
So, moving closer to home, being a native of Louisiana, I've never been to our state's knee, which is Arkansas sticking out of the boot. Other than I accidentally took a wrong turn on an interstate one time, and I went into Arkansas and went back to Memphis, which was probably a mistake given the way Memphis is, but my sister lives there. So in Arkansas, though, every single person who has said on this stage, and every interview I've had with anyone running for president or governor anywhere, continues to mention fentanyl as a huge issue and our southern border. And I know you've been to the border, and it continues to boggle my mind that this administration and the Secretary of Homeland Security continues to say it's secure, and yet not only is it not secure, we had Ron DeSantis here yesterday talking about the number of Chinese illegal aliens coming in on high-speed boats from the Bahamas that you've only got about an hour to rally and catch them, that they're being stopped, but a lot of them may be getting in. We've got huge gotaways. This isn't just a fentanyl issue, although it's huge, but also a massive national security issue.
Yeah, sadly, Arkansas has lost over 600 people to drug overdoses in the last year. I'm sure Georgia is much higher because of your larger population. And as you probably know, we've been losing 100,000 people a year to drug overdoses year after year after year for several years, which is, think about it, almost twice as much as we lost in the entire 20 years of the Vietnam War, every single year, year after year. And increasingly, the large majority of those, as you say, Eric, is from fentanyl, a uniquely deadly kind of poison. I don't even refer to fentanyl overdoses because there's no safe dosage of fentanyl that you get on the streets. It's fentanyl poison, in my opinion, and I think people should be held to account to it if they're dealing in fentanyl for murder charges. But almost all of that fentanyl, almost every single flake of it is made in Mexico. Much of it comes from Chinese chemical precursors as well. That means it's coming across our southern border. It's not just, as you mentioned, yet coming across on the land or coming across on the seas. I think last year there were over 10,000 violations of our airspace in the southern border as well, from drones being used to fly drugs across the southern border. So of course we don't have the border open. I mean, there's a lot of things we can do to combat the fentanyl epidemic in this country. The number one thing we could do is to close the border. And further, as you say, it's not just to protect our people from this kind of poison as well. It is a grave national security threat. 2 men were charged last year with trying to cross the southern border to assassinate George W. Bush. We now estimate that over 100 people on the terrorist watch list have crossed our southern border. And those are just the ones we know about. We don't know about the so-called gotaways who do not have an encounter with our border patrol. Russia has more intelligence officers in Mexico than any other country in the world. Think about that. Is Mexico really a threat to Russia? Not a country on its border. It's not China. It's not Finland. It's not historical adversaries like Poland. It's not even Ukraine. Mexico is where Russia has the most intelligence officers in the world. What do you think they're doing down there?
Okay, this is a fact I did not know.
Well, now
I bet
you do.
most people in the room didn't. Wow.
So Trotsky got an ice pick stuck in his head as well. So Russia has a long history of,
Yeah.
of making mischief in Mexico, and that inevitably is aimed north. And that's why there are hundreds, maybe thousands of Russians who have also crossed our border, in addition to Chinese, in addition to all. I mean, if you haven't been to the border, you'd probably be shocked not just by the chaos and the massive humanity you see there, but how many of them are not Latinos from Mexican or Central America or South America. I think now we're basically up to every country in the world has had someone cross the border. Last I checked, it was like 140 or 150 foreign nationals from different countries.
I'm going to bet Canadians aren't crossing the southern border. That may be the one. But, that brings up a point. A couple of others who've been here, and Ken Cuccinelli mentioned the number of illegal aliens who are now crossing from the Canadian border into New England.
Yeah, and too, the word is out. They know they're going to get in. This is why they used to wear their shirts say, "Biden, let me in." This started before Biden even took office. In the same way that when Trump won the election in November of 2016, illegal crossings dropped. It wasn't because Barack Obama decided to get tough in his last 10 weeks in office. It was the signaling effect that it sent. Illegal immigrants didn't want to make the journey anymore because they didn't think they would get in. Now, after about a year or so, it started trending back upward because the first few months in the Trump administration, he hadn't taken some of the actions that he would later take. But then once he took those actions, it started trending back down again. Because again, the word got out. People are sending back text messages. They're DMing on social media apps. They're calling homes like, you can come, get in, you're let in, or don't come. We just heard from our friend who came last month and he didn't get in. But the word is out all around the world. You have refugees too, people from countries that are war-torn or have genuine persecution in their borders, unlike the claimed persecution south of our border. They know that if they can afford a flight from their country in the old world into Mexico City or Monterrey, that they too can get into America.
I've always found this isn't just to blow smoke in your direction. You're one of the more thoughtful senators when it comes to thinking about things we may not be thinking about policy-wise. Right now, as you see the lay of the land and where we're headed through the election, obviously there are the election issues, but policy-wise, what are things you're starting to think about that maybe are on the horizon?
Well, I don't think it'll surprise any of you to know, and I'm sure most of you are worried about this as well. I worry about a conflict over Taiwan, the most dangerous flashpoint in the world, again, because of the signal that this president has been sending, is that we're going to hedge and accommodate and grant concessions to try to persuade dictators like Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping not to invade Ukraine or not to invade Taiwan. In the history of the world, that simply does not work. If you want to preserve the peace, it has to be done actively and assertively, and it has to be done by a power or coalition of powers with a greater preponderance of strength than the aggressive revisionist nations. And you can see this in both the history of World War I and World War II, that neither one of those wars were inevitable, certainly World War II, but if you had leaders in Western Europe who were willing to confront aggression early, firmly, resolutely, and assertively, you wouldn't have had either one of those wars. And I worry very much the lessons that Xi Jinping is taking from Joe Biden's actions, not just in Ukraine, but in the Middle East and towards China, is that if he goes for the jugular there, something he and every Chinese communist have wanted to do since the 1940s, then in the end, Joe Biden is going to blink. And he may be thinking too that the time is coming that he wants to take that risk. He himself is getting up there in age. He's got a third 5-year term. Not that they respect term limits in China, but that window closes in 2027. But the gap between America and China's power has closed over the years, in part because of their notorious cheating and trade and economic relationships has funded their military buildup. And it's getting smaller, but it's starting to even out, and it's probably going to start returning again because China is in a demographic death spiral. They barely have one child per couple now, partly because of their shameful one-child policy for so many years, and their economy is stalling out. He may think that the next 2 or 3 years is the window of opportunity he has with a weak American president and the closest gap in relative power between the United States and China, that he wants to do what he's always wanted to do, what Chinese leaders have always wanted to do, which is invade and annex Taiwan into mainland China. So I worry very much about that. That gets back to some of the points we were talking about earlier with the levels of defense spending, especially defense spending on the kinds of weapons that would be used to deter a conflict over Taiwan. Because we might be able to win that conflict, but I would much rather it not happen because China doesn't think they can successfully execute the operation because of America and our allies standing with Taiwan.
Domestically, with an election next year, this is probably our best chance now with the alignment to take back the Senate. So many other seats are seats where Democrats hold that even President Trump won those states. In 2022, we had just bad candidates in a number of states who failed miserably, who otherwise could have won. I mean, can you just explain for the crowd that understands that it's better to be in the majority than the minority, but may not understand exactly why in the Senate that's such a big deal?
Yeah, so it is a good opportunity for us. Unlike the House, where every seat is up for election every 2 years, in the Senate, only a third of the seats are up for every 2 years. Last year was a tough year for us. We had about 2/3 of those seats are up, but it's flipped this year. This year, I think we only have 9, maybe 10 seats up for re-election. The Democrats, therefore, have 21 or 22. Most of our seats are in fairly safe Republican states, places like Nebraska or Mississippi. I think the 2 toughest states we have are Florida, which has been trending in our direction, and Texas, which has remained a Republican state despite the Democrats' best efforts. Whereas they have a lot of endangered Democratic incumbents up for re-election in places like West Virginia and Ohio and Montana, which Donald Trump won twice, and in a bunch of purple states as well, like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona, Nevada. So if we can win those 3 seats alone in states that Donald Trump won in 2020, that gives us a majority of 52, assuming we hold all of our seats. If we can pick up a few of those purple seats, then we're adding a margin for error for the next couple cycles as we move back into a slightly less favorable map in Senate elections. And I cannot stress enough just how important winning a Senate majority is, even if it's just a 1-seat majority, although I'd rather have a bigger one. Just look at what's happened in the House this year. We did win the House. We didn't win quite as many seats as we might have liked in 2022, but it's put the brakes on the worst and most egregious excesses of the Democrats' agenda. There's no more talk of trillion-dollar spending bills. There's no more talk of packing the courts or making Washington, D.C. a state or federalizing our election laws or anything else. Just the ability to control the agenda of what comes in front of the Senate or what comes in front of the House makes a huge difference. I can't stress that enough. I know sometimes I hear people complaining that, well, the 2 parties aren't all that different. They often end up, colluding together, in their own interests in Washington against the people's interest. I understand where that's coming from, but I can tell you, seeing it up close for years now, there is a vast, vast difference between the 2 parties in Washington. And if we had won, for instance, just one of those runoff races here in January of 2021, everything that happened in the last 2 years would not have happened. There'd been no $2 trillion stimulus. There'd been no $1 trillion green energy boondoggle. All these radical judges had been appointed to the trial courts and the courts of appeals would not have been confirmed. It just makes a huge difference to actually control the agenda and set the calendar in the House and the Senate.
Regarding that, though, assuming we get a Republican president in a Senate, if we can, we've got $32 trillion in national debt that was a bipartisan spending. I mean, is there anything Republicans are willing to do, assuming they control all of government?
Well, I certainly hope so. I mean, I know some of your guests have probably talked about what the House is trying to do, which is move discretionary domestic spending back to the levels it was just 2 years ago in 2022. That'd be a good step in the right direction. I could say we could go back to 2019, before the pandemic. I don't remember that as being a time of particular austerity in America. And although that's not going to address the biggest sources of our federal debt, it starts to make a pretty big difference. If you chip away $10 billion here, $10 billion there, as they joke, that starts to add up to real money. And it especially adds up to real money over the long run when you're not paying interest on that debt at Joe Biden's new interest rates. So I think there is something we can do. And I would point out, too, that 2025 has the potential to be an extremely consequential legislative year, because that's when many of the Trump tax cuts of 2017 will expire, because they had an 8-year sunset on them. And the Democrats intentionally, in their two big budget bills in 21 and 22, put 2 or 3 year timelines on their bills, which meant those things are going to expire in 2025 as well. If we can hold the House, win the Senate, win the White House, we can craft that legislation to what we think the American people want, because that all those taxing and spending measures can be passed with a simple majority. They don't require a 60-vote threshold, which is typical in the Senate. So it's a hugely consequential legislative year in 2025, which makes 2024 an even bigger election year.
Okay, before you get off stage, let me ask you about the Biden administration in general, because you've been in the Senate through multiple administrations. Does it strike you that the criticism is fair that President Biden's administration is more a managerial class operation by progressives as opposed to him charting the course of the White House agenda?
No, Joe Biden is definitely in charge of things, because no one else could screw them up as badly as he has.
Okay, that's fair.
And I only say that half jokingly, and sadly, tragically, the best example of that, because I get this question a lot, is the fiasco in Afghanistan 2 years ago. I don't have a lot of close drinking buddies in the Biden administration, but I know enough people, especially military people, that I'm fairly confident almost every single one of Joe Biden's advisors, to include his own politically appointed advisors in the White House and the State Department elsewhere, discouraged him from that hasty, disorganized withdrawal from Afghanistan. But that was Joe Biden making that decision. It wasn't the Secretary of Defense. It wasn't the Secretary of State. It wasn't any general. It was Joe Biden, because that's what he wanted to do in 2009. That's what he kept badgering Barack Obama to do in 2009, if you read Bob Gates's memoirs about this time. And he's carried a chip on his shoulder for 12 years that Barack Obama didn't take his advice, that mostly took the advice of people like Hillary Clinton and Leon Panetta and the senior military leadership at the time. And for 12 years, Joe Biden carried that chip on his shoulder, and once he won the election, he was going to say, I'm going to prove that I was right all along. When all he really did was prove that he had, as Bob Gates said, he'd been wrong all along. Gates famously said that Joe Biden has been wrong about nearly every major foreign policy and national security decision for the last 40 years. My only quibble with that was he said it in 2014, so now you'd have to say it for the last 50 years. But on the biggest questions, like are we going to withdraw from Afghanistan with no plan to get our people out or get our friends out? Are we going to give Iran $6 billion in hostage ransom so they can take more hostages? Are we going to kowtow to China and plead with them to reduce carbon emissions 75 years from now, so we can let them fly spy balloons all over our plane and keep stealing our jobs? On those decisions, Joe Biden is still in charge, because you see how badly things are screwed up. Now, small things like what are we going to do on this or that small bill or piece of legislation, most presidents don't get involved in those things, and that's probably flying below his radar. But on the big things, it's Joe Biden. Which
I guess explains why no one's lost their job over Afghanistan, because
he can't fire himself. Yeah. That's 100%. 100%. That's the best single example of why Joe Biden is in charge, is what happened in Afghanistan. Only Joe Biden could have screwed it up so badly.
And speaking of that screw up, we can go back to, I guess, move back in there in foreign policy here at the end. About a minute left. The Taliban, it seems like they're providing more safe havens to terrorism there, that this could be a situation that, again, gets out of our control.
I know you're shocked to hear that the Taliban haven't turned out to be responsible governing partners in Afghanistan. Unlike what Joe Biden was saying 2 years ago. And they talked about these kind of over-the-horizon terrorism strikes against the terrorist groups that are reappearing in Afghanistan. At the time, and still today, I would refer to those as over-the-rainbow strikes, because they're simply not going to happen. There's one time the leader of Al-Qaeda was killed there. I know how it happened. Obviously can't share the details of it. I can tell you it's not something that can be replicated. That's why it's only happened one time in 2 years. And you had our commanding general for the region, testify in front of Congress earlier this year that ISIS in Afghanistan still aspires to strike our country. They could strike in as little as 6 months American interests or European interests around the world. And if they can get it to Mexico, they can just walk across our southern border to conduct terrorist attacks here.
Well, that's reassuring. Listen, thank you so much for doing this. Just so you guys know, Senator Cotton was one of the very first people who said, yes, I'll come to Atlanta and hang out with you. He's got to be a great friend, and I love our text exchange, which is never about politics, and it's a welcome retreat from all of that. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Eric.
Don't forget your shirt. Thank you.